Stanley Kubrick's second film, Killer's Kiss, made in 1955, was markedly different from his first, Fear and Desire, made only 2 years earlier. Kubrick famously disliked his first film, to the point where he later tried to remove it from circulation. He reportedly also disliked this film, although not enough to try the same thing. Honestly, I can see why he may have later felt that Fear and Desire was a bad representation, but I don't think it was anything to be ashamed of. Killer's Kiss, in my mind, is well made, although sometimes a bit rough around the edges. But it has a compelling story, interesting and evocative photography, and a hell of a pace. But in short, I suspect the reason Kubrick didn't later like this film was because it wasn't very Kubrick. He was still developing his style. The film is about 29-year-old boxer Davy Gordon, played by Jamie Smith. Davy lives opposite Gloria, played by Irene Kane, but voiced by Peggy Lobin. Because, like Fear and Desire, the entire film is dubbed, and when it came to ADRing, Irene Kane wasn't around. She should have just Skyped in, no one would have ever known. Anyway, dubbed, but in a far less jarring way than Fear and Desire, the story has Gordon witness Gloria be assaulted by her no-good boss, Vinnie Rapallo, played by Fear and Desire veteran Frank Silvera. After rushing to her rescue, Davy and Gloria fall in love, or they think they do. The film is very ambiguous about whether that love is real, an emotional reaction, or something more cynical. Davy and Gloria, after knowing each other for only 2 days, decide to leave New York together, so Gloria arranges to meet Rapallo at his club to collect her last paycheck, and Davy arranges to meet his manager outside of the same place. As you might have guessed, things don't go too well. Rapallo kidnaps Gloria and sends his 2 goons to kill Davy, but Davy is distracted by 2 fez-wearing rapscallions, and the goons mistake his manager for him and murder his manager. Imagine giving your alibi to the police if you were Davy. Where was I at the time of the murder, officer? I was chasing 2 harmonica players who were wearing fezzes, because they'd stolen my scarf. Davy later learns what happened, and confronts Rapallo, tries to rescue Gloria, and ends up fleeing from Rapallo and ultimately dueling him in a fantastically stark Brooklyn. The film ends, contrary to Kubrick's wishes but with the insistence of United Artists, with Davy and Gloria united at a train station, embracing. I feel as though the film could have worked, and maybe would have worked better, if it had ended with Davy alone at the train station, stood up by a woman who never actually loved him. And I think that's what Kubrick originally intended. But it wasn't meant to be. Now the story may sound very run-of-the-mill, and it is, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think you could accuse Fear and Desire of being pretentious, but the simple story here lends itself to a more straightforward and less pompous sort of feel. Unlike Fear and Desire, which I think maybe tries a bit too hard to appear adult and weighty, Killer's Kiss doesn't have a "isn't this clever" sort of vibe. I'd describe it as being much more comfortable with itself. There is one moment I think some people may find a bit pretentious, but personally I really like it and I think it really works. Gloria gives a 3.5-minute monologue that serves as the backstory for her sister Iris. I'm going to show you the last minute of that, so if you're familiar with this and you don't want to see it again, just skip for a minute from now.
A year passed like that. Her husband was a sweet man, but none of us paid much attention to him. And by then I'm sure he knew she didn't love him. But he never said anything. Then one cold winter morning, the maid woke us and said that Daddy was dead. Iris was like a stone. She didn't even blink. I began to cry and shout that I hated her, that she had only pretended with Daddy, and that she didn't ever love him. She didn't say a word. In his room, she stood quietly over his body for a long time and smiled. Then she went upstairs to her room and put on their favorite record. It was from one of her ballets. She played it very loud. A short time later, her husband found her in bed with the covers drawn up to her neck. She'd cut her wrists, and she was dead. She left me a note.
The dancer is Ruth Sobotka, Kubrick's second wife, and for the duration of the monologue, all we see is her dancing. Now, I've heard people criticise this as being too stagey, or as being hard to follow, or as being delivered in too smooth a manner. Well, it is a monologue, and it deliberately juxtaposes what we can hear to the mise-en-scène, but I think the reason I like it isn't just for its juxtaposition, but for the writing. It has a matter-of-factness about it that I think Kubrick admired and would later adopt as the tonal through-line for his other films. And that's where there's a huge difference between this and later Kubrick films. Killer's Kiss's tone and atmosphere don't have the same emotional distance or observational disassociation of something like The Shining or Barry Lyndon. The film is only 67 minutes, and although it does have moments of establishing shots, the general pace is breathless.
We had some ham and eggs and took our time saying goodbye to the bright lights. Then we went home. Downstairs in the courtyard, I suggested that we each go and get packed, and I'd come over when I was through.
I feel as though if Kubrick had made this 20 or 30 years later, with the same script, it could have been twice as long. Take, for example, this shot here with the narration.
I was kidding myself, and all I could think of was how much I wanted her. We made train reservations and wired Uncle George to brace himself for a niece, and then we began to get our finances together.
I think that had Kubrick made this film later, there'd be no narration over the shot of the sun setting, or much more space between the action and narration, so we have a few seconds of just the sun setting before we switch back to Rapallo. This may seem like a small thing, but I would bet if Kubrick could have later changed just one thing about this movie, it would have been the pacing. It's that makes this movie a pacey noir rather than typical of the director. Killer's Kiss shows that the filmmaking craft is still forming for Kubrick, although I personally still rate it very highly. To highlight this, and I don't think these things detract from the film at all, there are occasions where it seems some camera movement could have been a little smoother. The tracking of the subject could have been a little better. There's a little bit of lens flare, which although popular now, was back then usually regarded as an error in the shot. Some of the cuts are a little bit jarring. For example, the last shot of Frank Silvera and then the car pulling away doesn't quite cut together. I don't think it was necessarily the best angle for the second shot, and it seems as though we've skipped a couple of seconds in the sequence. That's a nitpick for sure. It really doesn't matter. And had the same thing happened in a $20 million film, it wouldn't bother me then. But I think all of this shows that ideas of blocking, camera position, and when to cross the 180-degree line and when to stay behind it are still forming in Kubrick's head. This was a very low-budget film, and often Kubrick had to shoot guerrilla style, sometimes from parked cars. There aren't any tracking shots I would call typical of Kubrick's latest style. He, after all, had to shoot from the back of a truck, rather than use a dolly and tracks. But there are examples here showing Kubrick was experimenting with various ideas. The use of handheld gives the film an occasional documentary feel, and was pretty different for the time. The recurring use of mirrors is indicative of melodrama, and of course offers a rich image no matter what the genre. But the shots of huge tenement blocks are imposing, and hint towards Kubrick's past as a stills photographer, where the use of light and shadow was everything. Many shots and ideas here appear later in Kubrick's career, and I think it may be a bit of a stretch to say that his use of mannequins in Killer's Kiss foreshadow his use of mannequins in A Clockwork Orange, but I think these sorts of weird images are more important at foreshadowing general ideas rather than specific ones. Then, of course, after he loses his fight, there's Gordon's dream. I'm afraid, Stanley. Of course, it isn't exactly the same as the famous black hole sequence in 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I think both these sequences are similar enough to say that they must come from the same sort of visual idea. Kubrick was on welfare when he made Killer's Kiss, but he sold it to United Artists for $100,000, and more importantly, they agreed to front a $100K budget for his next film. So, not only, in my opinion, is Killer's Kiss a tense and not entirely conventional film, It was also a pivotal part in Stanley Kubrick's career and in Kubrick becoming Kubrick. Join me next time where I will be discussing shocking imagery in film, violence and gore, how it's used, and the legitimacy of its use. See you then.
Who are those people in that picture over there?